A simple woman in a plain white dress walked through the towering ornate doors of the Royal Gambit Chess Club, a sanctuary of old money and quiet arrogance tucked away on Fifth Avenue. Heads turned instantly. She didn't belong. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their leather chairs, glanced over crystal-rimmed glasses, whispered behind manicured hands. She paused at the entrance, the sharp scent of polished mahogany and expensive cologne wrapping around her like a wall. And in that moment, everything changed. A smile-thin, practiced cruel curved across Victor Sterling's face, the reigning seven-time champion of the club, a man who had made a sport of humiliation, found his new entertainment for the evening. What happened next in just a few short minutes would shatter the walls of elitism that the Royal Gambit had spent nearly a century building. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive deeper, comment below, where in the world are you watching from? And if Grace Sullivan's story moves you, like it moved the hearts of everyone in that club, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary Wednesday night. Until she walked in. The Royal Gambit wasn't merely a chess club, it was a fortress. Founded in 1920, it had become a playground for the intellectual aristocracy, CEOs, scholars, retired generals. The marble staircase leading up to its entrance gleamed under streetlights, and the heavy wooden doors carved with medieval chess motifs loomed like a challenge to anyone without the right pedigree. Inside the floors were a mosaic of deep mahogany and black marble. Velvet armchairs circled polished chess tables set with handcrafted alabaster and onyx pieces. Chandeliers glittered above, casting a perpetual golden twilight over everything. Conversations were muted, refined. Laughter, when it came, was the soft clinking of crystal against crystal. Victor Sterling ruled this domain like a monarch. At 42, with salt and pepper hair, impeccably styled, and a navy suit tailored to near perfection, he was the embodiment of controlled confidence. His pale blue eyes missed nothing. From his usual seat at the center of the main hall, Victor surveyed the club, tapping a platinum chess knight cufflink against the table in idle boredom. Another evening of predictable victories. Another night of displaying dominance disguised as civility. Until Grace Sullivan. She entered quietly, almost hesitantly, her simple white dress, brushing just above the knees, cinched by an old leather belt that had seen better days. Her brown hair was tied back in a practical bun without a hint of salon perfection. No designer labels, no diamond accents, no visible armor of wealth. Just a woman with clear hazel eyes, a small canvas bag slung across one shoulder, and an expression of quiet determination that most mistook for meekness. The receptionist, a young woman whose pearl earrings and icy smile were part of the club's uniform, intercepted her with a tone of professional skepticism. "May I help you?" The unspoken message was clear. "You don't belong here." Grace smiled politely. "I'm here to meet Dr. Joseph Matthews, 8 o'clock. The receptionist raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Dr. Matthews, a senior member, was both highly respected and notoriously punctual. He called. "He's been delayed at the university," she said after a pause, her voice dripping with barely disguised judgment. "You're welcome to wait." Over there was a corner away from the main playing floor. Grace nodded undeterred and moved towards the indicated spot. She passed through the rich perfume of disdain without a flinch, settling into a leather armchair with a grace that seemed entirely her own. She crossed her legs, set her bag down, and really watched. Her hazel eyes scanned each board, each move with a focus that was almost unnerving. Victor noticed. He noticed the way her eyes didn't flit about aimlessly like a tourist's would. He noticed the subtle narrowing of her gaze as she assessed the games in progress. She wasn't here by accident, but to him and to many others in that room, a woman dressed like her, looking like her, couldn't possibly understand this world. Charles Westwood, Victor's loyal sidekick and echo chamber, followed Victor's gaze. "Who's she?" he muttered, half amused. Victor's lips curled into a predatory smile. "No idea, but she looks like she's here to clean the place, not to play." Laughter, low and venomous, buzzed between them. Without hesitation, Victor rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, a king deigning to engage with a peasant. Whispers rippled through the club like a breeze stirring dead leaves. Members leaned in to watch. It was rare, unheard of, for Victor to approach anyone outside his circle. Grace, seemingly unaware of the building storm, continued, observing a game nearing its end, a devastating queenside attack that the losing player hadn't yet noticed. Victor planted himself in front of her. "Enjoying the view," he said, voice oozing mockery. Grace looked up, her face a picture of neutral politeness. Yes, thank you, Victor smirked. Do you play a little? She answered simply. He chuckled, savoring the irony. How charming. Around them, more club members abandoned their games drawn by the scent of blood in the water. Victor was known for introducing outsiders to the club's standards. Swift, brutal games that left them humiliated and unlikely to return. I'm Victor Sterling, he announced loudly enough for the gathering audience to hear. Seven-time club champion Grace offered a small nod. Grace Sullivan? No recognition, no awe. Just the calm acknowledgement of someone who knew her own worth and didn't measure it by titles. Victor's smile tightened. He wasn't used to indifference. Would you care for a game, Miss Sullivan? He asked, dripping faux courtesy. We so rarely have the opportunity to welcome newcomers properly. Grace hesitated. The receptionist smirked behind her desk. Murmurs, mostly amused, a few pitying, filled the room. I'm waiting for someone, Grace said. Oh, it won't take long. Victor pressed the iron hand tightening inside the velvet glove. A crowd was gathering now, forming a loose ring around them, expecting a spectacle. The air buzzed with anticipation. Grace knew what was happening. She wasn't naive. Refusing would make her look fearful. Accepting would play into their hands. Either way, she would be judged. After a pause, she sighed. Very well, Mr. Sterling. One game. Victor's triumphant grin widened. He led her to a board in the center of the room under the grand chandelier, whose light seemed almost too harsh, too theatrical. The pieces were already set, gleaming under the spotlight. A clock was produced, set to 20 minutes each. Tournament rules, ladies. First, Victor said, sweeping an arm theatrically toward the white pieces. Grace smoothed her dress absently and ran her fingers over the white king, feeling the cool stone under her fingertips. There was a familiarity in her touch, something that didn't go unnoticed by the older members hovering at the edges of the crowd. Without fanfare, she moved her pawn to e4. A standard opening. Victor replied quickly, almost dismissively, with knight to f6, an aggressive choice, slightly unconventional. Grace responded, knight to c3 with a fluidity that caught Victor's attention. There was precision in her motion, not hesitation. He frowned slightly, a flicker of unease passing through him. Every choice in chess should be interesting, she had said. Victor pushed a pawn to a5, expanding on the queen side. A statement of control. Grace countered bishop to b5, pinning his knight against his king. A murmur ran through the crowd. Victor glanced up at her, studying her face for some clue, some hesitation. There was none. Her eyes were steady, clear, patient. He smiled thinly and continued. Move by move, the game unfolded, and with each passing turn, it became increasingly clear something was wrong. Victor, the master, the predator, was being forced to respond rather than dictate. He was reacting. Grace's pieces moved with quiet inevitability, like the tide coming in unstoppable, unconcerned with the fury of any man. And as the tension mounted, as the clock ticked relentlessly onward, one undeniable truth began to settle over the Royal Gambit Chess Club. Grace Sullivan was no ordinary visitor, and Victor Sterling had made a very grave mistake. Victor Sterling had never felt so exposed. The marble under his shoes seemed to tilt slightly, the walls of the Grand Royal Gambit Chess Club closing in tighter with each of Grace's silent moves. What had started as an evening diversion was quickly unraveling into something else, something he could not control. Yet Victor, a man built of pride and survival, wore his best mask, a tight-lipped smirk that no longer reached his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the polished surface of the chess clock, a staccato beat that betrayed the tightening coil of frustration inside him. Grace didn't even seem to notice, or if she did, she gave him no satisfaction of acknowledging it. Her every move was unhurried yet decisive, like a musician playing from memory, not just the notes, but the spaces between them. Around them, the atmosphere grew denser, the club's wealthy patrons crowding closer, their polite murmurs fading into an electrified silence. Even the waitstaff, usually invisible and silent, found excuses to linger near the main floor. Some pretended to polish brass fixtures that gleamed perfectly already. Others clutched empty trays like shields against the slow tectonic shift they were witnessing. Victor told himself it was just a fluke, an anomaly. Anyone could get lucky one. He pushed his rook aggressively, slamming it down with a little more force than necessary, the piece clicking sharply against the marble board. Grace blinked once almost lazily before countering by sliding her bishop into a position that neutralized his attack and threatened a devastating trap 2 moves down. The simplicity of her moves made them all the more terrifying. Charles Westwood, usually content to bask in Victor's reflected glory, now shifted awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Nearby, a few of the senior members exchanged uneasy glances. Sir Joseph Matthews, having arrived minutes earlier, leaned lightly against a mahogany column, watching the match unfold with a cryptic little smile that only deepened. With each passing move, Victor's mind raced. Every gambit he launched was met not with hesitation, but with surgical precision. Grace wasn't just playing well, she was anticipating him, reading him, stripping every layer of deception from his strategy until he sat exposed naked before her, every flaw magnified under the cold, unforgiving light of the chandelier. The clock ticked down mercilessly. Victor's 20 minutes bled away faster than he could compensate. Grace, by contrast, had used barely half of her time. Her breathing remained steady, her posture never shifted. Her fingers brushed each piece with the same gentle reverence, as if honoring old friends rather than commanding soldiers into battle. Desperation began to gnaw at Victor's composure. He needed to destabilize her fast. So he said, his voice louder than necessary, slicing through the oppressive hush, "Who taught you to play, Miss Sullivan?" A few members tensed at the break in decorum. Talking during a formal match was frowned upon unless offering or requesting a draw, but Victor had never cared much for rules when they didn't serve him. Grace placed her knight carefully on d5, sacrificing material in exchange for superior position. A master's choice, risky but devastating if correctly calculated. Then she lifted her gaze to meet Victor's, a slow smile curving the corners of her mouth. "I learned from observation," she said simply. It wasn't an answer, it was a dismissal. Victor gritted his teeth, the humiliation simmering just beneath his skin. He knew he couldn't back down now. Not in front of all these people, not when his entire identity, the unassailable king of the royal gambit, rested on this moment. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You play too well to be self-taught." Grace didn't respond. Her attention returned to the board, to the unfolding endgame Victor could barely cling to. His king was being cornered, forced step by step into a cage of his own making. Victor made his next move without thinking, a desperate advance of a pawn that opened a catastrophic weakness on his king side. The moment his fingers released the piece, he realized his mistake. He saw it mirrored back at him in the faint widening of Charles's eyes. And Grace simply tilted her head slightly, as if she had expected this exact move all along. Her rook swept into position. Check. Victor slammed the clock, his hand trembling now, despite his best efforts to appear nonchalant. Sweat prickled at the back of his neck. He shifted in his chair, shooting a glare at Charles, as if daring him to say something, to offer some excuse, any escape route from this public execution. None came. The crowd leaned in as one organism breath held the tension strung so tight it hummed. Grace captured another piece, whittling Victor's army down to a handful of desperate pawns and a king cornered like a wounded animal. Victor's next few moves were mechanical, driven by survival instinct rather than any real strategy. He fought not to win. He knew that possibility had sailed long ago. But to avoid the inevitable checkmate, a few more precious seconds, every square he fled to was just another step closer to being hunted down. And then, with a final flourish, so quiet, so understated, Grace slid her bishop into place. Checkmate. The silence in the royal gambit was total. Victor stared at the board as if it had betrayed him, as if the pieces themselves had conspired against him. His mouth opened slightly. A protest half formed, but no words came out. There were no excuses, no explanations. Slowly, robotically, he extended his hand across the table in the gesture of surrender demanded by chess etiquette. Grace shook it, her grip firm, her palm dry and steady. The crowd erupted, but not into applause, into whispers, hisses, half-formed questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? How had they not known? Victor pushed himself away from the table with a scraping sound of chair against marble and stood straightening his jacket with a jerk. His face, usually so composed, now showed cracks. The bright flush of embarrassment high on his cheekbones, the tight line of fury in his jaw. Grace remained seated for a moment longer, gently resetting the pieces on the board, restoring the battlefield to its original calm, as if honoring the game itself rather than celebrating her victory. Then she rose, her white dress catching the light like a sail, and shouldered her worn leather bag. She didn't gloat, she didn't bow, she didn't smile. She simply existed fully, unapologetically in the space that had tried so hard to reject her. As she turned to leave, the heavy oak doors at the front swung open again. A gust of city air swept into the room, scattering napkins and stirring loose papers, and there, standing framed in the doorway, like a specter conjured by fate, was Dr. Joseph Matthews. The old man's eyes gleamed behind his spectacles as he took in the frozen tableau, Victor standing stiffly beside the defeated board, the gathered crowd whispering feverishly, and at the center of it all, Grace Sullivan, calm, unbroken. Undeniable, Joseph smiled. Ah, he said, his voice warm with a private amusement that none could quite decode. I see you've all met my former student. A collective intake of breath swept through the room as if the entire club had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Victor turned stiff as a man on a scaffold to look at Joseph's student. He echoed the word falling heavily from his lips. Joseph nodded slowly as if savoring the moment. Oh yes, Grace was quite the prodigy. Grace offered no confirmation, no embellishment. She didn't need to. The truth now shimmered in the stunned silence, undeniable. As the checkmate that still lingered on the board, Victor's mind raced, flipping through years of forgotten tournament records, obscure legends, half-remembered whispers about a brilliant, unstoppable girl who had once been destined to redefine the world of chess before vanishing without a trace. His stomach twisted. He had not just lost to an outsider, he had lost to a ghost. And ghosts, he was beginning to realize, had long memories. Victor stood frozen, his polished shoes rooted to the marble floor, the phantom burn of humiliation clawing at his skin. Around him, the once admiring audience now buzzed with a current he couldn't control. Curiosity, awe, a hint of schadenfreude. The very air inside the royal gambit had shifted, tilting away from him, no longer revolving in the orbit he had so carefully maintained for years. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it, a crumbling of the pedestal he had built with bloodless victories and subtle cruelty. Grace Sullivan, no. Grace Bennett had done in 27 moves what none of his well-dressed rivals, none of the Ivy League prodigies, none of the foreign masters flown in for quiet exhibitions had managed to do. She had defeated not just his king, but the myth of invincibility he wore like a crown. And she had done it without raising her voice, without a single ounce of arrogance. Victor cleared his throat, the sound raw and too loud in the awkward silence. He needed to regain control of the room, of the story of himself. This could still be salvaged. He was Victor Sterling. After all, champion, icon, architect of the club's unshakable hierarchy, he could spin this. He forced a smile, a brittle thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Bennett, he said deliberately, using the name whispered in rising tones among the crowd. It's not often we have the honor of hosting a legend within our walls. The word legend left a sour taste in his mouth, but he pushed through it. Grace inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the comment without accepting the weight he tried to drape over her. I'm no legend, she said, her voice soft but firm. Just someone who enjoys a good game. A ripple of uncertain laughter fluttered through the gathered members. Some chuckled reflexively, unsure whether they were laughing with Grace or with Victor. Others remained silent, their eyes bright with the glint of a shifting allegiance they did not yet understand. Dr. Joseph Matthews stepped forward, his cane tapping lightly against the marble. With each deliberate step, he was not a tall man, but the gravity he carried with him made him seem to loom larger than life. His face, lined by time and wisdom, broke into a smile that was equal parts pride and defiance. You underestimate yourself, Grace, Joseph said warmly, and perhaps that is your greatest strength. Victor bristled, but said nothing. His mind raced, weighing the optics. If he pushed too hard now, he would look petty. If he retreated, he would look weak. He needed a middle ground, a way to assert himself without appearing threatened. Would you, Victor said carefully, consider a rematch? A collective murmur rose like a wave behind him. A rematch. It would be the redemption he needed, the narrative reset, and perhaps, he told himself, the first game had been an anomaly. A fluke. Grace studied him for a long moment, her hazel eyes unreadable. For the first time, Victor realized she was not sizing up him. She was weighing the value of her time, her energy, as if his challenge might not even merit the effort. Finally, she smiled. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it was understanding, and somehow that stung worse than if she had laughed in his face. I'm waiting for someone, she said again, the same calm refrain from earlier. Then after a beat she added, But if you wish for a rematch, Mr. Sterling, I have one condition. Victor's nostrils flared slightly. Conditions. He wasn't used to being negotiated with, at least not by anyone he couldn't immediately outmaneuver. And what would that be? He asked. Grace's voice was steady, carrying it easily to every ear in the room. If I win again, you'll agree to stop using your position here to belittle those who walk through these doors. Chess is a game of minds, not of appearances. There it was, the real battle. Not over the board, over the culture of the club itself. The crowd stirred. Some frowned. Others exchanged glances. A few nodded almost imperceptibly. Victor hesitated. He could feel the trap closing, and yet pride propelled him forward. He could not say no without conceding the very power he sought to protect. Agreed, he said through clenched teeth. And if I win, you will agree to give a lecture here, share your insights with our members. It was a good move. If he won, he could frame her appearance as a courtesy, a validation of the club's prestige. If he lost, well, he wouldn't lose. Not twice, Grace nodded once. Then we have a match. The chess set was reset with reverent hands. The white pieces gleamed anew under the chandelier's cold light. Victor sat down heavily, selecting black without protest. Grace took her seat across from him, unhurried, her face composed. The clock was reset. Victor hit the timer, and the second game began. Grace opened again with pawn to e4, a classic opening. But this time Victor was ready. He responded not with aggression, but with measured, studied defense. He built a fortress, a shell of pawns and pieces designed to frustrate and exhaust. He would not be lured into traps this time. He would wear her down. Move by move, the game stretched into a slow war of attrition. Grace played beautifully fluid, intuitive, almost effortless, but Victor clung stubbornly to every inch of ground, countering, resisting, forcing stalemates in miniature battles across the board. Sweat beaded at Victor's temples. His back ached from the tension coiling along his spine. Yet still he fought, drawing on every ounce of training, every buried instinct. The crowd watched in silence, the tension so thick it seemed to warp the air itself. And then, just when Victor thought he had stabilized, just when he believed he could force a draw and salvage his reputation, Grace shifted. She sacrificed a rook, an audacious, reckless move that left her queen momentarily exposed. Victor pounced. And in that moment, he realized his mistake. The trap was not in the rook. It was in the aftermath, in the space his own greed had created. 2 moves later, Victor's defenses lay in ruins. His king was exposed, surrounded, gasping for survival. Grace leaned forward slightly, her hand poised above the board like a painter about to lay the final stroke on a masterpiece. Check, she said, her voice a whisper that carried to every corner of the royal gambit. Victor's hand hovered over the board, frozen. He could see no escape, only inevitability. Slowly, mechanically, he moved his king, prolonging the agony. One more move, Grace's bishop slid into place. Checkmate. For the second time that evening, Victor Sterling, 7-time champion, king of the royal gambit, was defeated by a woman no one had recognized when she first walked through those gilded doors. The room exhaled as one, a soft, stunned breath. Victor sat back, the blood draining from his face. He looked up at Grace, who met his gaze without triumph, without mockery. Only a quiet certainty that left him feeling smaller than he had ever known possible. She stood, offering him the briefest of nods. Our agreement, Mr. Sterling, she said gently. Victor swallowed hard. His pride screamed at him to find some way out, some loophole, some excuse. But in the end, there was none. Only the truth. He rose slowly to his feet, turned to face the assembled members, and in a voice rough with defeat, said, Henceforth, the royal gambit welcomes all, regardless of pedigree. A beat of silence. Then Joseph Matthews stepped forward, clapping his hands once. Others followed tentatively, at first, then with growing conviction. Applause, real, spontaneous, unbidden, filled the room. Victor stood amidst it, hollowed out. Grace turned and walked toward the doors, without fanfare, Joseph falling into step beside her. Behind them, the club buzzed with a new energy. Not the brittle, self-congratulatory hum of before, but something fresher, something alive. And for the first time in a very long while, Victor Sterling found himself wondering, not about how to win, but about what it meant to truly deserve victory. The night air outside the Royal Gambit Chess Club hit Grace Sullivan like a cool balm after the suffocating tension inside. She inhaled deeply the familiar scent of the city asphalt, damp stone, distant street, food carts washing over her. Joseph Matthews walked beside her, his cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk, a sound as steady and reassuring as a heartbeat. Neither spoke at first. They didn't need to. The echoes of the evening still clung to them, thick and pulsing like a second skin. Behind them, the club's heavy doors swung shut with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. It wasn't until they reached the corner, where a row of cabs had idled under flickering streetlights, that Joseph finally broke the silence. "You handled yourself well in there," he said, his voice low, meant for her ears alone. Grace smiled faintly. "It was just a game." Joseph chuckled, a dreary knowing sound. "You and I both know it was never just a game." She said nothing. What could she say? That every move she made tonight had been a calculated risk, that stepping back into that world even for a few hours had scraped open wounds she thought had long since scarred over. A cab pulled up its tires, hissing on the wet street. Joseph gestured for her to enter first. Grace slid into the back seat, the cracked vinyl cool against her palms. As the cab pulled away, the city lights blurring past, she rested her head against the window and allowed herself a single shuddering breath. "Why did you come tonight?" Joseph asked gently. After a while, Grace turned her head slightly to look at him. In the dim light, his face was a map of lines and memories. "You asked me to," she said simply. Joseph smiled sadly. "I asked, but you could have said no. You almost did." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the city soothe her frayed nerves. "I thought," she began, then hesitated. Words were harder than chess moves, less precise. "I thought maybe enough time had passed that I could walk back into that world without it swallowing me whole." Joseph was silent, allowing her space to continue. "But it hasn't," she admitted. "It's still there. The pressure, the expectations, the judgment." Her voice caught slightly on the last word. Joseph reached out and patted her hand gently. "You don't owe them anything," he said. "You never did." Grace smiled again, small and weary. "Maybe, but part of me still wanted to prove something. To them, to myself." "You did," Joseph said firmly. "You proved you could beat them at their own game without sacrificing who you are." Grace looked out the window again, her reflection fractured by raindrops. "Did I?" The cab pulled up outside a modest brownstone in a quieter part of the city. Grace paid the fare, ignoring Joseph's attempt to reach for his wallet, and helped him out onto the sidewalk. Together, they made their way up the worn steps to the front door. Inside, the brownstone was warm and cluttered, filled with the comforting detritus of a life well lived. Books stacked in teetering piles, chessboards mid-game gathering dust, photos of smiling students and faded tournament posters yellowed with age. Joseph settled into his favorite armchair with a sigh of relief. Grace moved instinctively through the small kitchen, putting on a pot of tea. As the kettle began to whistle, Joseph spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You know they'll come for you," he said. After tonight, Grace poured the tea into two mismatched mugs. "Let them come. They'll want you to compete again," Joseph continued, "to wear the crown they tried to place on your head all those years ago." Grace sat down across from him, cradling her mug in both hands. "I walked away once. I can do it again." "But why did you walk away in the first place?" Joseph asked, his gaze steady. For a long time, Grace said nothing. The past rose up around her, thick and choking memories clashing with the scent of chamomile in her cup. "I was 15, she said finally. 15 and winning everything, and everyone told me how brilliant I was, how special, how destined for greatness." She laughed softly without humor. "But no one told me what greatness would cost." Joseph waited, patient as ever. "I lost my friends," she said, staring into the swirling steam. "Lost my childhood. Every move I made wasn't mine anymore. It was for sponsors, coaches, reporters. It wasn't about the game, it was about feeding a machine." Her hands tightened around the mug. "They said I was a prodigy," she continued, bitterness creeping into her voice. "But what they meant was I was a product, a brand." Joseph's face was unreadable, but his hands, old and steady, trembled slightly where they rested on the armrests. "And when I finally said I didn't want it anymore," Grace whispered, "they turned on me, said I was ungrateful, said I was throwing away a gift others would kill for." She looked up, her eyes shining. "I was a child, Joseph, a child who just wanted to love the game, not be owned by it." Joseph reached across the table and laid his hand gently over hers. You did the bravest thing anyone could do. You chose yourself. Grace swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. I thought I could forget, she said. Teach math, live small, stay invisible. You were never meant to be invisible, Joseph said softly. Your light's too bright. They sat in silence for a while, the old clock on the mantel ticking steadily. Finally, Grace spoke again, her voice steadier. Tonight felt good, she admitted. It felt right, playing for the sake of the game. Not for glory, not for approval. Joseph nodded. Then maybe it's time, Grace frowned. Time for what? He smiled that same enigmatic smile he wore the first time he saw her dismantle a national champion at 13. Time for you to show the world what life looks like when it's played on your terms. Grace laughed, then a genuine startled sound. You always were good at making things sound simple, she said. Joseph shrugged. The hardest truths usually are. She sipped her tea, the bitterness replaced now by something sweeter, something new. Maybe it was time not to reclaim the old path, but to forge a new one where she played because she loved it, one where she defined the terms, outside the rain eased, leaving the streets slick and shining under the city's pale light. Somewhere the future stirred, uncertain. Unwritten waiting. Grace set her mug down and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like running. She felt like playing. But this time she would choose the board, the rules, the pieces, and no one, no sponsor, no critic, no champion would ever again move her without permission. The queen was back, but she was no one's piece to command. The days after the match at the Royal Gambit passed in a strange sort of quiet. Grace returned to her regular life, or what passed for regular, in the tiny sun-washed classrooms of her elementary school. She stood before rows of eager, fidgeting children, chalk dust clinging to her fingertips, the ticking of the old clock overhead, marking time in a rhythm entirely different from the one she had lived by that night. And yet the memory of the club lingered like a subtle perfume she couldn't quite scrub away. She caught herself glancing at a blank chessboard tucked away in the back corner of her small apartment, caught herself sketching opening strategies absent-mindedly in the margins of lesson plans, caught herself replaying not just the games against Victor, but the precise sensation of moving pieces in a room full of doubters and winning. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten, a feeling that tugged at something buried deep, something still alive despite everything. She ignored the calls at first, the unknown numbers, the politely desperate voicemails, the invitations to return for another exhibition match, an offer from a publisher to collaborate on a book one she knew would be more about mining her mystique than telling her truth. She deleted them all without listening to the end. But then came the letter, a plain white envelope slipped into her school mailbox, nestled between permission slips and PTA announcements. No name on the return address, no logo, just her name, handwritten in careful script that felt oddly deliberate. She opened it without thinking, unfolding the heavy cream paper inside. The words were simple, almost too simple. Grace Sullivan. We have watched, we are impressed, an opportunity awaits not to relive the past, but to rewrite the future. If you are willing to listen, come to the address below. No obligation, only possibility. Saturday, 4 p.m., there was no signature. Grace stared at the letter for a long time, the weight of it settling in her hands. She didn't recognize the address, an upscale part of the city she rarely ventured into, but she knew instinctively that whoever had written this wasn't merely curious. They were serious. She considered throwing it away. She almost did. But something stopped her, that same restless flicker that had stirred when she faced Victor Sterling across a board, that quiet hunger. She thought she had smothered years ago, possibility. It was such a dangerous word. Saturday came wrapped in a slate-gray sky, threatening rain. Grace found herself standing in front of an elegant brownstone tucked between boutiques and art galleries, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat. She hesitated for a long moment, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest, then climbed the stairs and rang the bell. The door swung open almost immediately. A woman stood there, early 50s, impeccably dressed, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She didn't smile, but there was a certain warmth in the way she stepped back to let Grace intrude. Miss Sullivan, the woman said, her voice low and rich. Thank you for coming. Grace followed her through a foyer lined with modern art into a sunken living room, filled with deep leather chairs and walls lined with books. A fire crackled in a minimalist hearth. Everything about the space whispered wealth, but not the vulgar kind, the quiet generational kind that didn't need to scream to be heard. Another figure rose from a chair near the fire. Grace's breath caught. It was Winston Hale, world champion, emeritus chess royalty. A man whose matches she had studied until the positions burned themselves into her dreams. Older now, his hair silvered, but the intensity in his gaze undimmed. "Miss Sullivan," Winston said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palm warm. "It's an honor." Grace shook his hand cautiously, still unsure what web she had just stepped into. "Please," the woman said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit." Grace obeyed, perched on the edge of the leather seat, feeling absurdly like she had walked into a trap she couldn't yet see. The woman took the seat opposite her, crossing her legs neatly. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "I represent an organization you may not have heard of yet. We operate quietly, but our mission is simple: to elevate the game of chess back into the cultural spotlight, not through dusty old tournaments no one watches, through something new, something bold." Grace said nothing, waiting. "You see?" Evelyn continued smoothly. "Chess is having a moment again. Shows, documentaries, movies. People are hungry for it, but they don't just want brilliance. They want a story." Winston leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And you," he said, "are the story." The fire crackled between them. Grace felt its heat but could not seem to pull any warmth into herself. "We're forming a new league," Evelyn said, "invitation only. A blend of exhibition matches, high-stakes games, live broadcasts, a stage for the best players in the world, but also for the most compelling. And you want me," Grace said quietly, "to be part of it." "Not just part," Winston said. The words hung between them, heavy and inevitable. Grace laughed, then a short, incredulous sound. "You're asking the wrong person," she said. "I walked away from all that years ago." "You walked away," Evelyn said calmly, "because they tried to make you into something you weren't. We're offering you the chance to be exactly who you are and to show the world what that looks like." Grace shook her head slowly. "And what do you want in return?" Evelyn smiled, the barest hint of teeth. "Only that you play on your terms, but you play." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Grace stared into it, her mind a battlefield of warring desires. There was a part of her, small, stubborn, that wanted to run, to slam the door on all of it. A return to her students, her quiet life, her safety. But there was another part. The part that had awakened in the Royal Gambit. The part that wasn't ready to be invisible anymore. "You don't have to decide today," Evelyn said, standing. "Think about it. We'll be waiting." Grace rose, feeling the letter still folded in her coat pocket like a second heartbeat. Outside, the rain had started, soft and steady. She walked back to the subway station, the city's neon reflections puddling under her feet, her mind spinning faster than any opening gambit. They wanted her to be a symbol, a resurrection, a queen who had abdicated and was now being offered her throne once more. But thrones came with chains, and Grace Sullivan had sworn she would never be chained again. Still, as she boarded the train and found an empty seat, she couldn't deny the electric hum under her skin. Possibility. Dangerously sweet, she closed her eyes, leaning back against the window. Maybe she thought the game wasn't finished after all. Maybe it had only just begun. The week slipped by in a quiet tension. Grace could neither ignore nor name. Every morning she stood before her class, chalk in hand, guiding bright-eyed children through fractions and decimals, pretending the choice she faced wasn't humming underneath every word she spoke. At night, the city lights flickered outside her window like a restless heartbeat. The letter from Evelyn Hart stayed folded neatly on her kitchen counter, untouched but impossible to ignore. Each time she glanced at it, a familiar voice whispered inside her mind, the old voice, the dangerous one. "Come back." Grace had made her life small for a reason. She knew the cost of fame, the cost of being seen. It wasn't just the attention, the pressure. It was the way people stopped seeing you as human. You became a story. They owned a mirror for their ambitions and disappointments. She had vowed never to go back. And yet, when Joseph Matthews called that Friday evening, she answered on the first ring. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice warm, steady. The only voice that never made her feel like she was about to be measured and weighed. "Torn," Grace admitted, tracing the rim of her mug with a fingertip. "It's tempting." "It's natural," Joseph said gently. "You still love the game." "Yes," she said. Then after a pause, "But I don't love the spectacle." "You wouldn't be playing their game, Grace," Joseph said. "You'd be playing yours. This time you have the power to choose." She wanted to believe him. She almost did. Think carefully, he said, but don't let fear make your decision for you. She hung up feeling both lighter and heavier. That night, she dreamed of a chessboard stretching out infinitely into the darkness, the pieces whispering her name as she moved among them barefoot, searching for something she couldn't see. When she woke, the rain was lashing against the windows, and the decision still hung heavy in the air. It was Saturday again, exactly 1 week since the match at the Royal Gambit had cracked open the life she had so carefully sealed shut. Grace sat at her tiny kitchen table. The letter unfolded before her and stared at it. She didn't notice the knock at the door at first, a soft, insistent tap that barely rose above the sound of the storm. When it came again sharper this time, she pushed her chair back and crossed to the door. Standing there dripping rainwater onto the worn welcome mat was Charles Westwood. Grace blinked at him, stunned into silence. Of all the people she had expected or not expected, he had not even crossed her mind. "Miss Sullivan," he said, tugging off his cap awkwardly. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his expensive overcoat clung damply to his frame. "I'm sorry to show up like this. I didn't know where else to go." Grace stepped aside, wordlessly letting him into the narrow hallway. He smelled of rain and cold leather. Charles hovered near the doorway, his hands twitching at his sides as if unsure whether to sit or flee. "Why are you here?" Grace asked, folding her arms. He hesitated, then pulled something from his coat pocket, a slim folder, water-streaked but intact. "I thought you should see this," he said, offering it to her. Grace took it warily. She opened the folder and scanned the pages inside, and as she read, the blood drained from her face. It was a contract, an agreement between Victor Sterling and Evelyn Hart's organization. An agreement signed months ago, long before Grace ever walked into the Royal Gambit. The document spelled it out in crisp legalese. Victor would step down gracefully after a public loss staged to introduce a new face to the chess world. In exchange, he would receive a lucrative position as a global ambassador for the new league, complete with a generous salary, travel allowances, and a severance package guaranteed for 5 years. Grace felt as if the floor shifted beneath her feet. "You were a pawn," Charles said quietly. "They set you up." She stared at him, the folder trembling slightly in her hands. Victor wasn't humiliated by accident. Charles continued, it was part of the plan. He was supposed to lose to someone surprising, someone the world would rally around. Grace sank into a chair, the paper cutting into her fingers. "And if I had lost?" she asked, her voice hollow. Charles hesitated. "There were other candidates, backup plans." Grace laughed, then a sharp, broken sound. "Of course there were." It had never been about her talent. Not really, it had been about the story. The image, the sellable myth. She closed the folder with a soft thud, pressing her palm flat against it, as if she could crush the betrayal into silence. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Charles looked genuinely pained. "Because I was part of it." Grace stared at him. "I was supposed to steer you toward the rematch," he admitted, shame coloring his voice. "Make sure you stayed visible. Make sure you became the face they needed." "And now," she said. "Now," he said, meeting her eyes for the first time without flinching. "I think you deserve the truth." Grace rose slowly, her movements measured. "Thank you," she said, voice soft but cutting. "You can go now." Charles hesitated, then nodded and retreated back into the storm. Grace stood there for a long time after the door closed, the sound of rain drumming relentlessly against the glass. She wasn't angry. Not exactly, anger would have been easier. What she felt was older, deeper. A sorrow so vast it hollowed her out. She had dared to believe, dared to think the game could be pure again, and they had made her a piece on their board once more. She looked around her apartment, the tiny safe world she had built, and realized it wasn't enough anymore. Not because she craved the spotlight, not because she needed to prove anything, but because if she didn't move now, she would be letting them win in a different way. By silencing herself, by disappearing, by letting their betrayal define her. Grace picked up the folder again and stared at it one last time. Then she fed it page by page into the small metal trash can beside her desk. She struck a match, touched it to the paper, and watched the flames devour the lies. Tomorrow she would call Evelyn Hart. Tomorrow she would tell them her answer, but it wouldn't be the answer they expected. Grace Sullivan would return to the world of chess, but on her own terms. No sponsors pulling strings, no manufactured narratives, no more queens without crowns. Just the game, just the love, and this time no one, not even kings, would move without her permission. Grace stood at the edge of the polished marble stage, the bright lights above warming her skin, but never quite reaching the cold resolve inside her chest. The room stretched out before her. Hundreds of faces, cameras poised, notepads ready, all waiting for her to step into the spotlight they had crafted. She didn't move. Not yet. From where she stood, she could see Evelyn Hart near the side of the room, sharp in a midnight blue suit, her smile brittle and expectant. Winston Hale was beside her, arms crossed, looking every bit the grand chess master waiting for the Queen's coronation. They thought they knew what would happen next. They had planned every moment Grace Sullivan, the reluctant prodigy, stepping back into glory. The crowd rising to its feet, the headlines writing themselves, the new Queen of Chess, the second coming. A fairy tale reborn. Grace felt the weight of their expectation pressing down on her, a hand at her back trying to nudge her forward. But she stayed rooted where she was, letting the silence stretch, letting the discomfort bloom. She had agreed to come, yes. But she had not agreed to play their script. The cameras flashed once, twice, a ripple of impatience flickering across the gathered audience. Some of them shifted in their seats. Others whispered. Grace smiled small and to herself, then stepped forward into the light. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily through the hush. Every head turned toward her, suddenly and sharply attentive. She waited another beat, letting them taste the anticipation. "I know why you're here," she said. "I know what you were told to expect." A murmur stirred in the crowd. Not words yet, just a ripple of unease. "You expect a story." She continued, walking slowly toward the center of the stage. A comeback, a victory, a new face for an old empire. Evelyn shifted slightly in the corner, her hands tightening at her sides. "You expect me to pick up where I left off," Grace said. "To pretend the years away, to pretend the reasons I walked away no longer matter." She stopped now, dead center under the lights, every eye on her. "But they do matter," she said. "And tonight I'm not here to erase them. I'm here to honor them." A pause just long enough to let the words land. She turned her gaze outward, scanning the faces before her: journalists, investors, chess aficionados, old grandmasters leaning forward, young players with wide eyes and open notebooks. "I loved this game before I ever learned what people could take from it," she said. "I love the beauty of it, the honesty, the way a board does not care who you are, only how you move." She let her fingers brush lightly over the edge of the table beside her, where a pristine chessboard waited, pieces lined up in battle formation. "But somewhere along the way," she said, "it stopped being about the game. It became about the spectacle, about ownership. About who could claim me, control me, sell me." She straightened, and I walked away. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, but because I remembered something too many people had forgotten. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, a smile that was not bitter or cynical, but bright with the fierce light of a storm, burning itself clean. "I remembered that love, real love, cannot be bought, not even with the finest contracts, not even with the brightest lights." A stunned silence blanketed the room. Grace took a breath. "I will play again," she said. "But not as your product, not as your puppet, and not on your terms." A low gasp rippled across the crowd, quickly stifled. "I will play on my terms," Grace said, her voice rising stronger now. "In tournaments open to anyone, not just the ones who look right or speak right or have the right pedigree. I will teach children who can barely afford chessboards, not just those who can afford private clubs. I will play in parks, in schools, in places forgotten by the world until chess belongs to everyone again." A few faces in the crowd broke into startled smiles. Others stiffened in disapproval. Evelyn's face had gone cold and hard, her plans unraveling one strand at a time. Grace turned slightly, looking down at the board beside her. She picked up a single pawn, small, humble, overlooked, and held it up between her fingers. "This," she said, "was always my favorite piece." Another murmur, soft and confused. "Not the queen, not the king, the pawn," she said. "Because the pawn has no power, no status, and yet it is the only piece that can rise beyond what it was born to be. If it fights its way forward, if it survives, it can become anything." She set the pawn gently back down as if placing a promise. "I was a pawn once," she said quietly, "and they taught me to be ashamed of it." She straightened fully, the fire in her chest now, an unstoppable roar. "But now I choose it." She turned away from the table, from the cameras, from Evelyn's frozen glare. I won't be your queen, she said over her shoulder. I will be something harder to predict, harder to control. She smiled again, this time a razor's smile, and left the stage. A stunned beat of silence followed her. Then an explosion of noise, shouting, flashes, voices rising over one another in desperate questions. She would not answer. Grace pushed through the doors into the cold night air, the city unfolding before her like an open board. She didn't look back. Down the block, Joseph Matthews waited, leaning lightly on his cane. He smiled when he saw her approach, a proud, weary smile that said, I knew you could. Grace fell into step beside him without a word. Together, they walked the chaos behind them, fading into the hum of streetlights and distant traffic. You broke their script, Joseph said after a while, amusement glinting in his voice. I wrote a new one, Grace said. Joseph chuckled. That's harder than winning a match, you know. Grace shrugged, feeling lighter than she had in years. Good, I always liked a challenge. They walked on past the glittering windows of shops they couldn't afford, past the homeless man playing a battered guitar with more heart than half the symphony halls in the city. When they reached the park, Grace stopped. In the center of the square, battered folding tables waited, each with a cheap plastic chessboard and a ragged set of pieces. The regulars were there, old men with weathered hands, teenagers in hoodies, tourists with cameras slung awkwardly around their necks. Grace smiled. Mind if I play? She called out. An older man with a crooked grin waved her over. $5 a game, lady winner stays. Joseph leaned against a bench, chuckling under his breath. Grace sat down, spinning a white pawn between her fingers. The city moved around her, uncaring, unstoppable. The board was waiting. The world was waiting. And this time she was ready. She made her first move, a simple, unremarkable advance of a pawn. A beginning. Her own beginning. The city was quieter at dawn, as if the streets themselves were catching their breath. Grace sat at a worn chess table in the park, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her hands steady despite the bite of morning cold. Across from her sat a boy of about 10, his hoodie 2 sizes too large, his fingers drumming nervously against the edge of the table. It was his move. He stared at the board, brow furrowed in concentration, chewing on his lower lip. Grace waited, patient, not speaking. She had learned long ago that silence was often the greatest gift a teacher could offer, the space for someone to find their own way. After a long moment, the boy moved his knight, awkward but legal. Grace smiled, small and genuine, and nodded. Good. The boy grinned, a flash of white teeth against brown skin, and sat a little straighter. She moved her pawn forward, an opening toward the center. Not aggressive, but inviting. This was why she had come back. Not for the cameras, not for the trophies, gathering dust in glass cabinets, but for moments like this, for the pure connection between two minds across 64 squares, for the beauty of a game stripped down to its essence. Around them, the city began to stir awake. Vendors set up carts, cyclists, word passed early commuters, hunched against the cold. The world moved, and Grace remained rooted in the simple, profound rhythm of pawn and knight and rook. Check, the boy said suddenly, his voice cracking with excitement. Grace glanced down, then laughed softly. He had found a fork she hadn't guarded against a neat little trap that would cost her a rook or her queen. She tipped her king slightly in acknowledgement. Well played. The boy beamed, the pride in him so bright it made her chest ache. Want to go again? He asked eagerly. Before she could answer, a shadow fell across the board. Grace looked up, and for a moment the rest of the world blurred out. Victor Sterling stood there, his hands buried in the pockets of a heavy gray coat, his expression unreadable. He looked different somehow. Not just the casual clothes or the lines on his face made harsher by the raw morning light, but something deeper, something humble. I'll wait, the boy said, sensing the shift in the air, and he scampered off toward another table where a cluster of teenagers were setting up their own boards. Victor watched him go, then turned back to Grace. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me, he said quietly. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying him. I wasn't sure you'd want to be seen, she replied, not unkindly. Victor smiled faintly, the ghost of his old arrogance nowhere to be found. He gestured at the empty chair across from her. May I? Grace considered, then nodded. He sat down heavily, as if carrying more than just his own weight. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two players who had once stood on opposite sides of a silent battlefield, now finding themselves in a different kind of game altogether. I saw your speech, Victor said at last, the night you rewrote the rules. Grace said nothing, waiting. I was angry at first, he admitted. Not at you, at myself for not seeing it coming. She raised an eyebrow. Seeing what? He smiled, a little self-mocking. That you were never really playing the same game the rest of us were. Not then. Not now. Grace tilted her head slightly, considering. You built a kingdom, she said, but you forgot who the real players were. He chuckled dryly. I built a prison and crowned myself warden, and I called it winning. For the first time, Grace saw him not as an opponent, not as a symbol, but simply as a man flawed searching. You could still change, she said softly. You don't have to be who they made you. Victor glanced around the park at the makeshift games springing up in every corner, at the mismatched boards and battered pieces, at the laughter and arguments and triumphs playing out under the open sky. I don't know if I can, he said honestly, but I'd like to try. Grace smiled, and this time it was full of genuine warmth. Then play, she said, not for the audience, not for the title, just play. Victor looked down at the chessboard between them. One game, he asked. One game, Grace agreed. He reached for the black pieces, letting her take white. Grace placed her first pawn on e4, the move as familiar to her as breathing. Victor responded with a cautious defense. No grand gestures, no mind games, just a move honest and simple. They played in silence, the moves coming not from some ancient script of competition, but from instinct, curiosity. Even Grace realized with a shocked joy, for the first time she saw a glimmer of the boy Victor must have been once before. Ambition and pride had twisted the love of the game into something colder. They drew a small crowd unnoticed at first, then growing as passers-by paused to watch, sensing something different in the air. Not spectacle, not rivalry, something purer. By the time the game wound down to a tense but friendly draw, there were dozens of people gathered, some clapping, lightly, others just smiling. Victor leaned back, exhaling slowly. Thank you, he said. And this time the words were real, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. Grace stood, offering him her hand across the board. He took it, his grip steady and sure. No more kings without queens, he said, half smiling. No more pawns without dreams, Grace replied. They parted with a nod. No fanfare, no grand announcements, just two players stepping off the board on their own terms. Grace watched him go, disappearing into the slow, brightening morning. Then she turned back to the boy, waiting eagerly at the next table, his eyes wide with hope. Ready? She called. He nodded vigorously. Grace smiled and sat down once more. Around her, the world kept moving, messy, loud, imperfect. And for the first time in a long, long time, Grace Sullivan felt perfectly at home within it. She reached for her pawn, moved it forward into the unknown, and began again. A beginning. Her own true beginning. And this time she wasn't playing to win, she was playing to live.